A king in northern India owned 3 palaces, one for each season, and he could not sleep. His name was Pasenadi. He ruled the kingdom of Kosala, one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. He had musicians whose only job was to play through the night, cooks who had spent their entire lives learning to prepare a single dish, dancers, gardens, a harem, servants who anticipated every need before he felt it, marble floors cool under his bare feet at midnight, jasmine drifting in from the courtyard, the sound of a fountain somewhere beyond the walls, and none of it was enough. He did not come to the Buddha as a devotee. He came as a man who had tried everything a human being can acquire and found that the acquiring did not work. The text Dinestarn both describe him arriving heavy, exhausted, unable to explain what was wrong. He had no enemy at the gates, no illness, no tragedy. He had everything, and he could not sleep. The Buddha did not say, "Stop wanting things." That is the version most people know. The bumper sticker, the Instagram caption, the cocktail party summary of 2,500 years of teaching. Desire causes suffering. Stop desiring. Find peace. The Buddha tried that. He tried it for 6 years. He starved himself until you could see his spine through his stomach. He ate 1 sesame seed a day. He sat in the cremation grounds, surrounded by bones and ash. He did every practice the ascetics of his time could teach him, and it nearly killed him. What he actually said, when he recovered, when he sat under the fig tree, when he finally understood, was something far more specific, was something far more. He did not say, "Stop wanting things." He said, "You are wanting the wrong way," and the difference between those two ideas changes everything. There is a mechanism behind your dissatisfaction, not a vague spiritual principle. A mechanism with 3 moving parts, each operating differently, each producing a different kind of suffering. One of those 3 parts is the craving you already know about. The second is harder to see. And the third, the one you have almost certainly never heard named, might be the one running your life right now. But the story starts here, with a king who had 3 palaces and no rest. Pasenadi did not arrive once. The Pali texts record multiple conversations between him and the Buddha. Not the polite exchanges of a king honoring a holy man, but the raw questions of a man who could not understand why his life felt wrong. In one exchange, the text says Pasenadi had been gorging himself. He came to the Buddha so full he could barely sit, sweating, breathing heavily. The Buddha did not lecture him about discipline or moderation. He recited a single verse, the Dhammapada verse, about eating with awareness, not rules. Awareness. And here is the detail that most retellings miss. The Buddha did not tell Pasenadi to eat less. He told him to watch the wanting, to see the exact moment when the food stopped being about hunger and started being about something else entirely. The moment when the hand reaches for one more piece, not because the body needs it, but because the mind cannot stop reaching. You know this moment. You have felt it at a dinner table, in front of a screen, in the middle of the night, standing in front of an open refrigerator you do not need. The reaching, the grasping for something that has nothing to do with what your hand is actually holding. 1900 years after Pasenadi sat sweating in front of the Buddha, a German philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer sat in his apartment in Frankfurt and wrote a sentence that could have come from the Pali canon. Life swings like a pendulum backward, and forward between pain and boredom. That was 1818. Schopenhauer had read the Upanishads, but not the Buddhist suttas. He arrived at the same diagnosis through pure observation. The human machine is built to want. And the wanting does not stop when you get what you want. It just changes shape. But Schopenhauer had no cure. He saw the disease and called it the will. A blind, relentless force driving all living things toward goals that would never satisfy them. His prescription was resignation. The Buddha saw the same disease 23 centuries earlier, and he had something Schopenhauer did not: a map of the mechanism, a precise, technical map of exactly how wanting becomes suffering, and exactly where the chain can be broken. That map begins with a word. The word is TANHA. Say it like TANHA. Every English translation renders it as desire or craving. But the Pali word means something more specific. It means thirst. Not a preference, not a wish. Thirst. The kind you feel when you have not had water for a full day. The kind that makes you unable to think about anything else. The kind that burns. And this changes the teaching completely. The Buddha was not saying desire is the problem. He was saying thristis is the problem. The burning quality of the wanting. The fever. Not what you reach for, but the desperation in the reaching. A person can want a glass of water and drink it calmly. That is not tanha. A person can want a glass of water and feel like they will die without it. Drain it, gasp, reach for another before the first has settled. That is tanha. Imagine you are thirsty, genuinely, painfully thirsty, and someone hands you a glass of salt water. You drink. It tastes like water. For a moment, the thirst seems answered. Then it comes back worse. You drink more. It gets worse. You drink more. This is what the Buddha was describing. Not wanting. The wrong kind of wanting. The kind that intensifies the more you feed it. Pasenadi had 3 palaces, 3 glasses of salt water, and each one made him thirstier. But the Buddha did not stop there. Because tanha, this thirst, is not one thing. It has 3 distinct forms, 3 mechanisms, each operating in a different part of your life, each disguised as something reasonable, each promising satisfaction, and delivering the same result. The king in the palace, the merchant in the market, the prince in the cremation ground. Each was driven by a different mechanism. Each thought he was solving a different problem. And all 3 were drinking salt water. The first mechanism you will recognize immediately. The second one, the one that destroyed a kingdom, is harder to see. And the third is the one most of us run on every single day without ever knowing its name. Before Pasenadi. Before the palaces and the sleepless nights. Before the teaching even existed. There was a young man sitting in the dirt on the bank of the Naranjara River. And he was dying. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He had been a prince. He had left a palace of his own, a wife, a newborn son, every comfort the ancient world could provide, because he had seen something that would not let him rest: old age, sickness, death. The fact that every person he loved would eventually be taken from him, and no amount of wealth could change that. So he left, and for 6 years, he did exactly what the popular version of Buddhism tells you to do. He stopped wanting things. He joined a group of 5 ascetics, men who believed that the body was a prison and that starving it would set the spirit free. He ate 1 sesame seed a day, sometimes a single grain of rice. His ribs pressed against his skin like a washboard. His eyes sank into their sockets. The texts say that when he touched his stomach, he could feel his spine through the front of his body. Dust caked on his skin, his hair matted. He sat in cremation grounds, surrounded by the smell of burning flesh and old bone, and he tried to want nothing. It did not work. 6 years, the most extreme possible version of let go of desire. And at the end of it, he was not enlightened. He was starving. He was weak. He was no closer to understanding suffering than the day he left the palace. The only thing he had proven was that wanting nothing is its own form of torture. Then, something happened that every version of this story includes, but almost no one stops to think about. A village girl named Sujata found him collapsed near the river. She was carrying a bowl of rice milk, a preparation she had made as an offering to a tree spirit. She saw this skeleton of a man lying in the dirt, and she offered it to him instead. He ate the taste of rice milk after years of nothing. Warm, sweet, the body waking up, the mind clearing, and in that moment, the moment a man who had tried to kill every desire allowed himself to eat, something shifted. Not a revelation, not yet, but a direction. The answer was not in the starving. The answer was not in the having. The answer was somewhere else. Entirely. The 5 ascetics watched him eat. They were disgusted. They had spent 6 years starving alongside him, and now he was eating rice milk like a common householder. They turned their backs and walked away. They went to the deer park at Isipatana, near Varanasi, and they left him alone on the riverbank. What Siddhartha did next is the most important thing he ever did, and it had nothing to do with sitting under a tree. He rejected the experiment. 6 years of data, the most rigorous possible test of stop wanting things. And the result was clear. It did not work. Wanting nothing did not end suffering. It just replaced one form of suffering with another. This is the part that the bumper sticker leaves out. The Buddha did not teach stop wanting things, because he tried stopping wanting things and it failed. The teaching he eventually gave, the one he walked to the deer park to deliver to those same 5 ascetics who had abandoned him, was not a call to renounce desire. It was a diagnosis, a precise technical diagnosis of how the mind generates suffering. And the first word of that diagnosis is the most mistranslated word in all of world religion. The word is dukkha. Say it like dukkha. Every English translation you have ever seen says suffering. Life is suffering. The first noble truth. It sounds absolute. It sounds bleak. And it is wrong. If dukkha meant suffering, if the Buddha was saying life is painful, then the teaching would be obviously false. You are not always in pain. You have had moments of real joy. You have laughed until your sides hurt. You have watched a sunset and felt something open in your chest. If the Buddha was saying none of that counts, that all of life is agony, then either he was wrong or the translation is. The translation is wrong. The Pali word dukkha was never a word about pain. It was an engineering term. In the workshops of ancient India, when a wheel had a bad axle hole, when the hole at the center was off, the wheel did not break. It did not stop turning. It wobbled. Dukkha, do, bad. Ka, the hole at the center. A bad axle hole. A wheel that turns but never runs true. Not agony, not punishment, not a cosmic verdict on existence. A wobble, something slightly off-center. And here is why this changes everything. A wobble can be fixed. Pain is something you endure. A wobble is something you diagnose and correct. Pasanadi's life was not painful. He had 3 palaces, musicians, gardens. His life wobbled. Something at the center was off, and no amount of marble floors or jasmine gardens could fix it, because none of those things were the axle. They were decorations on a wheel that would not run true. Your life wobbles too. Not all the time, not in every moment, but you know the feeling, the thing you were sure would make things better. And it did, for a week, and then the old feeling came back. The promotion that felt like everything on Friday and ordinary by Wednesday. The relationship that was electric for 3 months and then became the background noise of your days. Your mind works like a thermostat set to not enough. You raise the temperature, new job, new car, new city, and the thermostat recalibrates. The gap between where you are and where you feel you should be stays exactly the same size. Pasanadi had 3 palaces, 3 recalibrations. Same gap. The Buddha stood in the deer park at Isipatana and told the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him that life is not painful. Life wobbles. And the wobble has a cause. Not desire, not wanting. TANHA, thirst, the specific, burning, feverish quality of wanting that intensifies the more you feed it. And then he said something that no other teacher in the ancient world had said. He said the thirst is not one thing. It has 3 forms, 3 mechanisms. Each one grabs you differently. Each one promises something different. And each one delivers the same result. The wobble continues. He named them, and those 3 names, spoken in a deer park in northern India, to 5 men who had just watched him eat rice milk and thought he had given up. Those 3 names are the most precise diagnosis of human dissatisfaction ever produced, more precise than Schopenhauer, more precise than Freud, more precise than any modern self-help book that tells you to practice gratitude and think positive. Because the Buddha was not offering advice. He was offering a map of the machine that promises you happiness and never delivers. A machine with 3 moving parts. And once you see the parts, once you can name them, the machine loses its power, not because you destroyed it, because you saw it. If that just changed something you thought you knew about what the Buddha actually said. A like helps more people find this. And the 3 mechanisms? The first one you will recognize immediately. It walks through a market every evening buying things it does not need. The second one destroyed a kingdom. And the third one, the one you have never heard named, might be the reason you cannot put your phone down at midnight. The story of the first mechanism begins in a market in Savatthi, and a man who sold perfume. There was a merchant in Savatthi who sold perfume. He was not poor. He had a home with a courtyard garden, servants who brought him food, a wife, children. His stall in the market was one of the finest, small glass bottles arranged in rows, oils, pressed from sandalwood and jasmine and cinnamon bark, each one worth more than a laborer earned in a month. He was successful by every measure his world had to offer. And every evening, just before the market closed, he walked past one more stall. He never needed anything. His home was full. His family was fed. But the oil lamps on the vendors' tables caught the glass and the brass and the bolts of dyed cloth, and something in him reached. Not hunger, not necessity, just reaching. Coins warm from his palm pressed into another merchant's hand. Another thing he did not need carried home in the dark. The Buddha had a word for what was driving this man from stall to stall. He called it TANHA, the first mechanism, the thirst for sensory pleasure. Not the enjoyment of pleasure, the thirst for it. The reaching. The pull toward the next sensation before the current one has even settled. Kama tanha is the easiest of the three to recognize because it is the one you see. The second bowl of ice cream you did not need. The purchase you forgot about by Thursday. The scroll through your phone that started as a 2-minute break and ended 40 minutes later, with your thumb still moving and your mind empty. You were not looking for anything specific. You were looking for the next small hit of pleasant, the next notification, the next image that gives you a quarter second of something. The merchant did not enjoy what he bought. That is the part the texts make clear. He enjoyed the buying. The moment of reaching, the moment of contact, the moment the coin leaves the hand and the new thing arrives. That moment was the drug. What happened after? Carrying the thing home, placing it somewhere, forgetting about it, that part was nothing. The pleasure was in the wanting, not the having. You have felt this. You know the gap between the anticipation and the arrival. The restaurant you spent 2 weeks looking forward to, and the meal itself was fine, just fine, and on the drive home something in you was already thinking about the next thing. The gap is not a flaw in the particular restaurant or the particular meal. The gap is the mechanism. Kama tanha is a machine that runs on anticipation. The moment of having is always less than the moment of reaching. Always. Not sometimes. Always. The Buddha saw this 2,500 years ago. A neuroscientist at the University of Michigan proved it in a lab in the 21st century. But that comes later. The merchant in Savatthi was caught in the first mechanism. But there was a prince in Magadha caught in something worse. Because kama tanha, the craving for pleasant things, is at least honest. You can see it. You can name it. The second mechanism hides. His name was Ajatasattu. His father was Bimbisara, king of Magadha, one of the most beloved rulers in the ancient world, and a personal patron of the Buddha. Bimbisara had given the Sangha, the community of monks, a bamboo grove to live in. He had visited the Buddha for teaching. He was, by all accounts, a good king and a decent man. His son wanted the throne, not the power, not the wealth, not the specific things a king possesses. Ajatasattu wanted to be king. The identity, the title, the feeling of being the one at the center. He wanted to walk into a room and have every head turn. He wanted to speak and have his words become reality. He did not want what a king has. He wanted what a king is. The Buddha had a word for this. Bhava tanha, the thirst to become, the second mechanism. And it is the most dangerous of the three, because it wears the mask of something admirable. Ambition, purpose, growth, self-improvement, the voice in your head that says, I will be happy when I get the promotion, when I finish the degree, when I lose the weight, when I am finally the person I am supposed to be. Ajatasattu could not wait for the throne. The thirst was too strong. He imprisoned his father. The texts say he locked Bimbisara in cells and cut off his food, his own father, the man who had held him as an infant. And Bimbisara, the texts say this, and it is one of the most devastating details in all of Buddhist literature. Bimbisara did not curse his son. He did not rage. He walked back and forth in his cell, practicing walking meditation with the techniques the Buddha had taught him, until he died. Ajatasattu got the throne. He sat in the throne room at night, alone, the echo of his own footsteps on the stone floor. His father's face in every shadow. He could not sleep, the same symptom as Pasanadi. A king who had everything and could not rest. But Pasanadi's sleeplessness came from wanting more pleasant things. Ajatasattu's came from wanting to be someone, and the someone he had become. A man who murdered his own father was not the someone he had imagined. This is what Bhava Tanha does. It promises identity. It says you will feel whole when you become the thing you are reaching toward. CEO, published author, good mother, respected expert, thin, successful, healed, and the becoming itself becomes the craving, not the thing, not the role, but the feeling of arriving. Except you never arrive, because the moment you become the thing, the thermostat resets, and the next version of who I should be appears on the horizon, and the thirst starts again. Ajatasattu's Bhavatanha cost him. His father. Yours probably costs you something quieter. The present moment. The ability to sit in your life as it is, right now, without the low hum of not yet, not enough, not there yet, running underneath everything. Kama Tanha grabs outward, toward things, sensations, experiences. Bhava Tanha grabs forward, toward a future self that will finally be enough. And then there is the third mechanism, the one the Buddha named, that almost no one in the modern world has heard of. The one that might explain more about your daily life than the other two combined. The Pali word is vibhava tanha. Vibhava. The prefix vi is a negation. Bhava is becoming existence. Vibhava tanha is the thirst for non-existence. The craving to not be. Not suicide, though in its extreme form, yes, that too. In its everyday form, vibhava tanha is the craving to escape, to disappear, to not be here, in this body, in this life, in this moment. You know this craving better than you think. It is 11 at night, and you are not tired, but you cannot bear being awake with yourself, so you scroll, not toward anything, away from everything. The third glass of wine on a Tuesday that is not about enjoying wine, but about blurring the edges of a day that felt like every other day. Binging a show you do not even like because the alternative is sitting in the silence with your own thoughts. That is vibhava tanha, the craving to be elsewhere, the craving to be no one, the craving to disappear into a screen, a substance, a sensation, anything that makes the self go temporarily quiet. This is not laziness. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is the third mechanism of craving, the one the Buddha named 2,500 years before anyone called it numbing, dissociating, checking out. 3 mechanisms. 3 ways the thirst operates. Kama Tanha reaches toward pleasant sensation. Bhava Tanha reaches toward a future identity. Vibhava Tanha reaches toward oblivion. And all 3 share the same structure. They are salt water. Each one promises relief. Each one intensifies the thirst. Kama Tanha is salt water in a beautiful glass. Bhava Tanha is salt water from a deeper well. And Vibhava Tanha, that is pouring the salt water over your head and hoping it will wash you clean. In 1986, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan named Kent Berridge did something unusual with a group of rats. He destroyed their dopamine systems completely. The chemical most people associate with pleasure wiped out. And then he gave them sugar water. The rats still liked it. Their facial expressions, and yes, Rats have measurable facial responses to taste, showed the same pleasure signals as rats with fully functioning dopamine. They licked their lips. They showed every sign of enjoyment. But here is what changed. They stopped seeking it out. A bowl of sugar water placed directly in front of them. They would drink it and show pleasure, but they would not walk across the cage to get it. They would not work for it. They would not press a lever. The wanting was gone. The liking remained. Then Berridge ran the experiment in reverse. He boosted dopamine, flooded the system, and the rats consumed more sugar water than ever, pressing levers frantically, crossing cages, working harder and harder for the next drop. But their facial pleasure responses did not increase. They wanted more. They enjoyed the same amount. The gap between wanting and liking, a gap most of us assume does not exist, turned out to be enormous. Berridge had stumbled onto something that the Buddha had described with a single word 2,500 years earlier. TANHA, the thirst that drinking cannot quench. Dopamine does not produce pleasure. It produces wanting. The chemical most people call the feel-good neurotransmitter has almost nothing to do with feeling good. It has everything to do with reaching, seeking, grasping, the hand in the market extending toward one more stall, the thumb scrolling past one more post, the mind leaning toward one more version of who you could become. Your brain has separate circuits for wanting and liking, separate wiring, separate chemicals. Wanting runs on dopamine, a massive system that evolution built to keep you chasing, seeking, reaching. Liking runs on a much smaller, more fragile system. Opioid receptors in tiny clusters. Berridge calls hedonic hotspots, some no larger than a cubic centimeter. The wanting system is a highway. The liking system is a footpath. And the highway almost always wins. This is why the merchant in Savatthi enjoyed the buying more than the having. His dopamine system was firing in the reaching, the anticipation, the approach, the moment before the coin left his hand. Once the object was acquired, the dopamine dropped. The pleasure system registered a faint signal. And the wanting system was already scanning for the next stall. This is why Ajatasattu killed his father for a throne that gave him nothing. Bhavatanha, the thirst to become, runs on the same dopamine circuit. The anticipation of being king, the imagined future, the identity glowing on the horizon, dopamine surging. And then he arrived. He was king. And the dopamine dropped. The throne was just a chair. The crown was just metal. And the wanting system, undaunted, began scanning for the next thing to become. This is why vibhava tanha, the craving for escape, keeps pulling you toward your phone at midnight. Scrolling is not pleasurable. You know this. You have never put your phone down after 45 minutes of scrolling and thought, that was wonderful. But the dopamine system does not care about wonderful. It cares about the next small hit, the next thumbnail, the next autoplay. The system was built to seek, and it will seek even when the seeking produces nothing. Because seeking is the product. The process is the point, not the destination. The Buddha did not have an fMRI. He did not know about dopamine or opioid receptors or hedonic hotspots. But he saw the same architecture. He saw that the thirst and the satisfaction were two different things. That you could be consumed by wanting and feel no pleasure. That you could chase and chase and chase and never arrive. He saw it in Pasanadi. He saw it in the merchant. He saw it in his own 6 years of asceticism. Because vibhava tanha runs in reverse too. The craving to escape the body, to escape sensation, to escape existence, that is still craving. Still tanha. Still salt water. And here is what most people miss about the Buddha's teaching. He was not saying craving is bad. He was not making a moral judgment. He was making a mechanical observation. He was saying, you have a machine inside you that promises satisfaction and cannot deliver it. Not will not. Cannot. The architecture does not allow it. The wanting system and the liking system are not connected the way you think they are. You can want more without liking more. You can chase harder without arriving closer. The machine is doing what it was built to do, and what it was built to do is keep you chasing, not keep you happy. 3 mechanisms, 3 names. Kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. The merchant, the prince, the person scrolling at midnight. You have spent your entire life calling all 3 wanting, as if they were the same thing. They are not. Kama tanha grabs toward sensation. Bhava tanha grabs toward identity. Vibhava tanha grabs toward oblivion, and each one requires a different kind of seeing to interrupt. You cannot fix bhava tanha by cutting back on shopping. You cannot fix vibhava tanha by setting career goals. The wrong diagnosis produces the wrong treatment. And most people, most self-help books, most productivity gurus, most therapists are treating all 3 as if they were one disease. The Buddha was more precise, and his precision has a practical consequence. Once you can name which mechanism is operating, right now, in this moment, in the reaching your hand is doing, or the leaning your mind is doing, the machine becomes visible, and a machine you can see is a machine that begins to lose its grip. But naming the 3 mechanisms is only half the map, because between the moment something touches your senses and the moment the craving ignites, there is a gap, a fraction of a second. So fast you have never noticed it. But it is there, every single time. The Buddha found it in a deer park. A neuroscientist at Brown University found it in an fMRI 2,500 years later. And what happens in that gap, that invisible split-second space between sensation and thirst, is where the entire teaching lives. The story of that gap begins with a young woman on a street in Savatthi, carrying something no medicine could fix. A young woman walked through the streets of Savatthi, carrying a dead child. She was not weeping. She was asking for medicine. Her name was Kisa Gotami. The texts say she was thin. Kisa means thin, from a poor family, married into a household that barely tolerated her until she produced a son. The son was everything. Her place in the family, her identity, her proof that she belonged. And now, the child was dead. And she was walking through the streets, holding his body, knocking on doors, asking each household for medicines that would bring him back. They told her the child was dead. She would not hear it. She kept walking, dust on the road, the weight of the child growing heavier with each door. The same answer at every house, spoken with varying degrees of pity. There is no medicine for this. And she kept walking. Finally, someone directed her to the Buddha, not as a spiritual teacher, as a physician. She arrived holding the child and asked him for medicine. The Buddha said yes. He said, "Bring me a mustard seed, just one, from a household where no one has ever died, no parent, no child, no spouse, no sibling. Bring me that seed and I will make the medicine." She went, door to door. And this time the question was different. "Do you have a mustard seed?" Yes, every house had mustard seeds. "Has anyone in this household ever died?" And behind every door, the same answer. "My father, last year. My daughter, 2 monsoons ago. My husband. My mother, my firstborn. We too have lost someone." Every door, every house, every family in Savatthi had known this. She was not carrying a unique tragedy. She was carrying the human condition, and somewhere between the 20th door and the 50th, the texts do not say when, something shifted. She stopped asking for the mustard seed. She put the child down. She went back to the Buddha, and the text says she asked not for medicine, but for teaching. This is the most misunderstood story in Buddhism. It is not a story about accepting death. It is a story about TANHA, about the craving for reality to be different than it is. Kisa Gotami's craving was not for a thing, not for sensation, not for identity. It was for the world to work differently than the world works. My child should not be dead. This should not have happened. The universe owes me a different outcome, and that craving, that deep bone-level refusal to accept what is true, is the one that burns hottest, hotter than kama tanha, hotter than bhava tanha, because you cannot argue with it. Of course she wanted her child back. Of course the desire was justified. The Buddha never said the desire was wrong. He said the burning, the tanha, the thirst, the fever of insisting that reality must be different, was the source of a second suffering layered on top of the first. The child's death was the first suffering. The refusal to let the child be dead was the second. And the second was the one she could do something about. Remember the king who could not sleep? Pasenadi had 3 palaces and wanted more pleasant things. Kama tanha. Kisa Gotami had 1 child and wanted him back. Something deeper. Something that touches every person alive. Different objects. Same mechanism. Same burning. Same word. Tanha. And the same gap between the event and the burning. The same invisible fraction of a second where everything happens. The Buddha called that fraction of a second Vedana. Say it like Vida Nach. Every English translation says feeling, but Vedana is not what you think of when you hear the word feeling. It is not emotion, not sadness, not happiness, not anger. Vedana is something faster than all of those. Something that happens before you even know it has happened. Vedana is feeling tone, the split-second tag, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, that your mind applies to every single sensation the moment it arrives. Before you decide how to react, before you form a thought, before you even recognize what is happening. Something touches your senses, a sound, a taste, a notification on your screen, a memory that surfaces, and in a fraction of a second, your mind tags it. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. That tag is Vedana. And here is what the Buddha saw that no one before him had articulated. The tag is where Tanha is born. Pleasant Vedana. The mind reaches toward it. That is Kama Tanha igniting. Unpleasant Vedana. The mind recoils. That is Vibhava Tanha igniting. And between the Vedana and the Tanha, between the tag and the reaching, there is a gap, a space, an interval so brief that you have lived your entire life without noticing it. But it is there. The chain runs like this. Something touches your senses. Contact. Then Vedana, the tag. Then Tanha, the thirst. Then Upadana, clinging, grasping. The moment the thirst hardens into a fixed position, then suffering. The chain is fast. Contact to suffering in under a second, and you experience it hundreds of times a day without ever seeing the links. Right now, as you hear this, your mind is tagging. This sentence, is it interesting or boring? Pleasant or neutral? You did not choose the tag. It arrived. And based on that tag, your attention is either leaning forward or pulling back. That is the chain. That is Vedana operating in real time. And you did not notice it until someone named it. The Buddha named it in the Madhupindika Sutta, the Honeycomb Sutta, one of the most precise psychological documents in the ancient world. He described the chain link by link: contact, Vedana, TANHA, Upadana. And then he said something that changes the entire practice. He said the chain can be seen, and what can be seen can be interrupted, not suppressed, not fought, not denied, seen, just seen. In 2011, a psychiatrist at Brown University named Judson Brewer put experienced meditators into an fMRI scanner and watched their brains in real time. He was looking at the posterior cingulate cortex, a region deep in the middle of the brain that activates when you get caught up in craving, when you want something, when you ruminate, when you scroll. When the mind is grasping, that region lights up. The meditators sat in the scanner and practiced, and the posterior cingulate cortex went quiet. Not through effort, not through suppression, not through gritting their teeth and trying not to want things, the opposite. Through what Brewer describes as curiosity. The meditators were not fighting the craving. They were watching it. They were doing exactly what the Buddha described, seeing the chain, seeing Vedana arise, save, seeing Tanha follow. And in the seeing, just the seeing, the chain slowed. The posterior cingulate cortex deactivated. The craving center of the brain went still, not because the craving was destroyed, because it was seen. Brewer had found the gap, the same gap the Buddha described in the Madhupindika Suttas, the gap between Vedana and Tanha, the gap between the tag and the reaching, the gap that Kisa Gotami found somewhere between the 20th door and the 50th. When she stopped insisting reality should be different and started seeing reality as it was. Vedana is the moment your tongue touches the water before you taste the salt. If you can feel that moment, the split-second, pleasant, unpleasant neutral, you can put the glass down before you swallow, not because you are strong, not because you are disciplined, because you saw the glass. And a glass you can see is a glass you can choose to set down. But seeing the chain is one thing. Living with the chain broken is another. What does a life look like when the fever cools? The answer shows up in the strangest possible place. A man who swept streets. His name was Sunita. He was an untouchable. In the caste system of ancient India, untouchables were not at the bottom of the hierarchy. They were beneath it, outside it entirely. Sunita swept streets. That was all he was allowed to do. Clear the refuse that higher castes would not touch. When a Brahmin walked down the road, Sunita pressed himself flat against the wall. If his shadow fell across a Brahmin, it was considered pollution. He lived his entire life making himself smaller. Invisible. The sound of his days was the scrape of a broom against stone, and the sweat running down his back, and the silence of a man who had been told since birth that he was nothing. The Buddha walked down that street one morning, and he did not walk past. He stopped. In front of Sunita, the texts say Sunita panicked. pressed himself against the wall, lowered his eyes, tried to disappear the way he had trained himself to disappear every day of his life. And the Buddha spoke to him, not past him, not above him, to him, asked him his name, asked him if he would like to leave this life and join the Sangha. Sunita stared. A Brahmin would not look at him. A prince was asking him to come. He said yes. The texts say. Sunita became an arahant, a fully awakened being. The man who society said was worth less than the dirt he swept became someone who needed nothing. Not because he acquired status, not because he climbed the caste ladder, not because the system changed its mind about him. He became free of needing the system to validate him at all. Think about that. Sunita's entire life was bhava tanha imposed from the outside. Not the craving to become something, the craving to become someone, anyone, a person whose shadow does not pollute, a person whose name is worth speaking. The system had planted that thirst in him before he was old enough to question it. And the Buddha did not tell him to fight the system. He did not tell him to earn his way into respect. He showed him that the thirst itself, the need to become someone in the eyes of others, was the chain. And the chain could be broken. Not by becoming a Brahmin, by seeing that the need to become anything at all was the fever. And the fever could cool. Sunita did not become wealthy. He did not become powerful. He did not become respected by the system that had crushed him. He became free of needing any of those things. And the texts say that freedom was visible on his face. The merchant in Savatthi walked past, stalls wanting more. Sunita pressed against walls, wanting to be different. Two men, two types of tanha, same chain, same gap, same possibility of freedom. One man driven by kama tanha, the pull toward pleasant things. The other driven by bhava tanha, the pull toward an identity he was told he could never have. And the teaching was the same for both. Not stop wanting. See the wanting. See the chain. Find the gap. But here's the question you might be asking. If this is true, if the mechanism really works the way the Buddha described, then why does the modern world still not know? Why do people keep chasing? Why does every generation build taller buildings and all faster cars and more sophisticated distractions and end up no happier than the generation before? In 1978, a psychologist named Philip Brickman and his colleagues at Northwestern University published a study that should have changed everything. They found 22 major lottery winners and compared their happiness levels to a control group of ordinary people. The expectation was obvious. People who had won life-changing sums of money should be significantly happier. They were not. 1 year after winning, the lottery winners were not significantly happier than the controls, but the study revealed something worse, something that cuts deeper than the headline. The lottery winners reported getting less pleasure from ordinary experiences. A sunny day, a conversation with a friend, a good meal. The things that once registered as pleasant had become flat, muted. The winning had not raised the floor of their happiness. It had lowered the ceiling. The thermostat had reset. The set point moved, and the gap between where they were and where they felt they should be, stayed exactly the same size. Brickman called it hedonic adaptation. The Buddha had a word for that gap. Dukkha, the wobble, the off-center axle that no amount of winning can fix. Pasenadi had 3 palaces. The lottery winners had millions. Same result, same sleeplessness, same wobble. The numbers change, the addresses change, the century changes. The mechanism does not. And here is what makes this more than an academic curiosity. Brickman's study did not just show that winning fails to produce lasting happiness. It showed that winning actively damages the ability to enjoy what you already have. The dopamine system, Berridge's highway, recalibrates. It needs more to produce the same signal, and the liking system, the fragile footpath, gets trampled. The merchant walks past one more stall. The lottery winner buys one more house. And each purchase raises the threshold for the next one. Salt water, every glass. You are on this treadmill. Not because you are greedy, not because you are ungrateful, not because you have a character flaw that gratitude journaling will fix. You are on it because the machine is doing what it was designed to do. Evolution built a wanting system that never shuts off because the organisms that stopped wanting got eaten by the ones that did not. Your dissatisfaction is not a bug. It is a feature that made perfect sense on an African savanna 100,000 years ago and makes no sense at all in a world where your basic needs are met and the wanting continues anyway. The Buddha saw the feature. He did not try to override it with willpower. He did not try to outrun it with more acquiring. He mapped it. Contact, Vedana, TANHA, Upadana, suffering, 5 links. The chain fires hundreds of times a day, and the place it can be interrupted is not at the end, not at the suffering, where you try to cope, distract, numb. The place it can be interrupted is at the gap. Between Vedana and TANHA, between the tag and the reaching. The fraction of a second where the mind has not yet grasped. That is where the entire teaching lives. Not in a monastery, not in a philosophy, in a fraction of a second. Inside your own nervous system. If you are still here at this point, you are not watching casually. You want to understand this. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay, because the question left is the most important one. If the answer is not stop wanting, what is the answer? What does the fever breaking actually look like? Not in theory, not in a sutta, in a human life. The answer begins with a serial killer on a road outside Savatthi, and it ends with a dying man under a pair of sal trees. There was a man on a road outside Savatthi wearing a necklace made of human fingers. His name was Angulimala. Anguli, finger, mala, garland. He had been a student once, a bright young Brahmin named Ahimsaka, the harmless one, studying under a teacher who grew jealous of him. The teacher told him that to complete his training, he needed to bring 1,000 right-hand fingers from 1,000 different people. It was a death sentence disguised as an assignment. The teacher expected him to be killed in the attempt. Instead, Ahimsaka became the killer. 999. That is how many fingers hung around his neck when the Buddha walked onto the road. Nearly 1,000 people maimed or dead at the hands of a man who had started as a student named Harmless. The villages surrounding Savatthi had emptied. People had fled. King Pasenadi, the same king who could not sleep, had assembled an army to hunt him down. The Buddha walked toward him alone. Angulimala saw the monk on the road and began running. One more finger, one more kill, the 1,000th. And then something happened that the text describes with a specific detail that has stayed in the human imagination for 25 centuries. Angulimala ran. He ran fast. A man who had chased down 999 victims could run. But he could not reach the Buddha. The Buddha was walking. Not running. Not hurrying. Walking at a normal pace. And Angulimala, sprinting, pouring sweat, the dust rising under his feet, the necklace of bones rattling against his chest, could not close the distance. He screamed, "Stop, monk!" And the Buddha, still walking, said over his shoulder, "I have stopped. It is you who have not stopped." That single sentence broke something open. Angulimala stopped running. The texts say he stood in the road, panting, the dust settling around him, and something in him collapsed. Not his body, something behind his body, the momentum that had been carrying him from kill to kill, the chain that had been firing. Contact, Vedana, TANHA, Upadana. Action. The chain snapped. He dropped the sword. He asked to be ordained. The Buddha said yes, but the story does not end with the ordination. And this is the part most retellings leave out. Angulimala became a monk. He wore robes. He begged for food. And the villagers, the people whose families he had destroyed, stoned him. The texts describe him returning to the Buddha, with blood running down his face, his robes torn, his begging bowl smashed. He had done nothing to provoke it. He was simply walking through a village where people remembered what he had been. The Buddha looked at him and said, "Bear it. You are experiencing now what would have taken many lifetimes to unfold." This is not a story about forgiveness. It is not a story about redemption in the way the modern world uses that word. It is a story about TANHA and what happens when the chain breaks completely. Angulimala's killing was driven by the chain, not by evil, not by nature, but by a momentum that had built from a single poisoned instruction and compounded through 999 repetitions. Each kill made the next one easier. Each finger on the necklace lowered the threshold for the next. The same mechanism as the merchant walking past one more stall. Except the stakes were life and death. The same dopamine highway barrage, mapped in rats. Except the reward was not sugar water, but the brief, terrible relief of completing the task. And the Buddha did not fight him. He did not run from him. He did not preach at him. He walked. And Angulimala, who had outrun every person he had ever chased, could not catch a man who was walking. Because the Buddha had stopped. Stopped the chain. Stopped the reaching. Stopped the fever. And a person who has stopped, truly stopped, cannot be caught by a person who is still running. That is not a metaphor. That is the teaching in action. The question Angulimala's story raises is the question you have been carrying since the beginning of this video. If the answer is not stop wanting, if suppression does not work, if the Buddha tried it and rejected it, then what did the Buddha actually do? What was the stopping he described? What does it look like when the fever breaks? In 1946, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl published a book about his years in Auschwitz and 3 other Nazi concentration camps. He had lost his wife, his parents, his brother. His manuscript, his life's work, had been confiscated and destroyed. He had been stripped of everything a human being can possess, and in that absolute zero of having, he found something that craving could not touch. Frankl wrote a sentence that sounds like it was translated from Pali. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space, is our freedom and our power to choose our response. Between stimulus and response. Between contact and reaction. Between Vedana and Tanha. Frankel found the gap. The same gap the Buddha described in the Madhupingthika Sutta. The same gap Judson Brewer saw deactivate the posterior cingulate cortex. The same gap Kisa Gotami found somewhere between the 20th door and the 50th. The same gap Angulimala found when he stopped running, and the dust settled and the chain went quiet. The gap is not a technique. It is not a practice you master after 10,000 hours. It is a seeing. The Buddha's word for it was sati, usually translated as mindfulness. But the Pali means something closer to bare attention. Seeing what is happening while it is happening. Not analyzing. Not judging. Not planning what to do about it. Seeing. The chain fires. Contact, Vedana, Tanha, and sati is the awareness that sees the chain as a chain. Not from outside the experience. From inside it, like watching your own hand reach for the glass of salt water and, in the seeing, feeling the grip loosen. Not because you forced it, because you saw it. This is what the Buddha called nibbana. Say it like ni-ba-h-na. Every English version says enlightenment. It sounds like a destination, a mountaintop. A state of cosmic consciousness reserved for monks who meditate for 30 years in a cave. That is not what the Pali word means. Nibbana means the cooling. It means the blowing out of a flame. Specifically, the flame of TANHA, the flame of thirst. The fever going out. Not because someone poured water on it, because the fuel ran out. And the fuel, the Buddha's word is upadana, the same word that means clinging. The fuel is the grasping, the reaching, the insistence that reality must be different. Stop feeding the fire, and the fire goes out on its own. Not with a dramatic extinguishing, with a quiet cooling, the way a fever breaks in the middle of the night, and you wake up, and the sheets are damp, and the burning is gone, and you did not do anything to make it stop. It just stopped because the conditions that sustained it were no longer being fed. The answer was never finding fresh water. It was putting the glass down, not because water is bad, not because thirst is wrong, but because salt water cannot quench thirst. And tanha, that burning, that fever, that thirst, cannot be quenched by giving it what it wants. It can only be cooled by seeing, by the bare, unadorned, unflinching act of seeing the mechanism while it runs. Angulimala saw it on a dusty road, when a walking monk outpaced his running. Kisa Gotami saw it at the 50th door. When she stopped asking for medicine, Sunita saw it when a prince spoke his name, and he realized he had never needed anyone to speak it. Pasenadi, the king who could not sleep. The texts say he began sleeping after his conversations with the Buddha. Not because he got more, because he started seeing the wanting. The thermostat became visible, and a thermostat you can see is a thermostat that starts to lose its authority. You cannot change its authority. You cannot change the temperature. You cannot force yourself to stop wanting. But you can see the thermostat. You can see the mechanism, and the moment you see it, really see it, the grip loosens. Not because you tried, because you saw. The Buddha died at the age of 80 in a small town called Kusinara, between two sal trees. On a night, the text sal tree was quiet, except for the sound of Ananda weeping. He had been walking for months. His final journey across the plains of northern India, teaching as he went, stopping at villages, eating what was offered. In one of those villages, a smith named Kunda prepared a meal for him. The texts are not certain what the food was. Some translations say pork, others say a kind of mushroom or truffle. Whatever it was, the Buddha ate it and became violently ill. Dysentery, pain, the body failing. He did not stop walking. He walked with Ananda, his personal attendant for 25 years, the man who had memorized every sermon, who had been at his side through everything. And they made their way to a grove of sal trees outside Kusinara, the late afternoon light coming through the branches, the smell of blossoms. The Buddha asked Ananda to prepare a resting place between two trees, with his head to the north. Ananda broke. He walked behind one of the trees and wept. Not the quiet tears of a composed monk, but the raw, uncontrolled grief of a man watching the person he loved most in the world prepare to die. The Buddha called for him, "Ananda, do not weep. Have I not told you that all things that are dear to us must change and pass away? How could it be otherwise?" This was not philosophy. This was a dying man speaking to his closest friend. And the teaching about TANHA, about the thirst for reality to be different, was right here. Ananda's grief was not wrong. The Buddha did not say stop grieving. He said, see that the grieving is the insistence that this moment should be something other than what it is. The child should not be dead. The teacher should not be dying. Reality should be different. That insistence, that second layer of suffering, is tanha, and it can be seen. Even now, even in this, monks came from across the region. They gathered in the grove. Some sat in silence, some wept. The Buddha gave his final instructions. Practical, specific, not mystical. He did not appoint a successor. He said the teaching itself would be their teacher. He said anyone who practiced diligently could find what he had found. He did not say it was easy. He did not say it was fast. He said it was possible. And then he spoke his last words. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Work out your liberation with diligence. The Pali word for that last instruction, the very last word the Buddha ever spoke, was appamadana, with diligence, with non-negligence, with sustained, careful, wakeful attention. Not, I have arrived. Not, I am at peace. Not, the fever is permanently extinguished, and I am done. His last word was an instruction to keep paying attention, to keep seeing the chain, to keep finding the gap, because the gap is not a place you reach once and stay. It is a place you return to, moment by moment, breath by breath, sensation by sensation. For as long as you are alive, the man who taught the world to stop craving did not die having stopped. He died paying attention. And that is the teaching. Not a destination, a direction. Not the absence of wanting, the presence of seeing. Here is what this means for you. Not for a monk in ancient India. Not for a meditator in a retreat center. For you, right now, wherever you are hearing this. The first thing, the Buddha never said, stop wanting things. He tried that for 6 years and nearly died. What he actually taught is that craving has 3 specific mechanisms: kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, and each one operates differently in your life. The merchant walking past one more stall is not the same as the prince killing his father for a throne, and neither is the same as the person scrolling at midnight, trying to disappear. They feel like the same thing because the culture calls them all wanting. They are not the same thing. and the treatment for each is different. The second thing, the next time you feel dissatisfied, and you will, probably today, probably within the hour. Do not try to fix it by getting what you want. Do not try to fix it by wanting less. Instead, find the gap, the split second between the sensation and the reaching. Vedana. Feel the tag. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Just feel it. Do not act on it. Do not suppress it. Watch it the way you would watch a wave approach a shore. Not fighting it, not swimming toward it, just watching. The chain breaks there. Not with effort, with seeing. Judson Brewer's meditators did not fight craving. They watched it, and the craving center of their brains went quiet. Not through force, through curiosity. You can do this. Not perfectly, not permanently, but right now, the next time the hand reaches, the next time the mind leans, see it. That is the practice. That is the entire practice. The third thing, you are not a person who wants too much. You are not broken. You are not weak for never being satisfied. You are a person running a program you never chose. A program written by evolution to keep you chasing. A program that made sense on a savanna and makes no sense in a world where your basic needs are met. And the wanting continues anyway. The Buddha's word for seeing that program clearly was sati. And the moment you see the code, you are no longer the program. You are the one watching it run. That is not a small shift. That is the difference between being dragged by the current and standing in the river, watching the water move around you. You do not leave the river. But you are no longer drowning. Here is what I want to know from you. Which of the three, Kama Tanha, Bhava Tanha, or Vibhava Tanha, is the one running your life right now? Not in theory. Right now. Today. This week. Be honest. Say it in the comments. Because naming it is the first step the Buddha prescribed. The chain cannot be interrupted at a link you cannot see. And the seeing starts with a name. If this changed how you see yourself, even slightly, subscribe. There is more here. Every teaching in this tradition was designed for real people with real suffering, and there is so much more to say. Share this with someone who keeps chasing and never arriving. Someone who works harder and harder and wonders why the satisfaction never lasts. They need to hear this, not because it will fix everything, because it will show them the machine. And a machine you can see is a machine that begins to lose its grip. The Buddha did not find happiness. He found something better. He found the off switch for the machine that promises happiness and never delivers. And he left the instructions for anyone willing to look, not by wanting less, not by trying harder, not by finally getting the thing you have been reaching for your entire life, by seeing, just seeing the thirst, the salt water, the thermostat, the gap. 2,500 years ago, a man sat under a fig tree and saw the code. He spent the next 45 years showing other people how to see it, too. And his very last word, the last breath he used, was not a conclusion. It was a reminder. Pay attention.